XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.
Welcome to Exploring the Energy Markets, exploring the hot topics in the oil markets. My guest today is Claudio Galimberti, Chief Economist at Rystad Energy. Claudio and I spent long years at Shell together, long years at Rystad Energy. He's a very renowned and important voice in the media and the market, a macroeconomist, an integrator of all kinds of energy systems, connecting the dots, and the architect behind building the house view for Rystad Energy. Claudio has a long career. He's from Italy, long career with Shell. He worked for S&P as well in the US, leading the innovation, leading the market analysis. And he's a very well-traveled man across the globe, connecting with very senior executives, connecting with strategists, connecting with investment banks, and all kinds of energy portfolio holders. Today, I'm going to talk about what's hot in the market related to the US energy dominance, the US economy, discussions on Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Canada, China, and ultimately the idea is to build a so what for the oil markets. The goal is not to just give projections. The goal is also to enable the analyst. And that's what the mission with the XAnalysts is, to really bring out the thought process, the ways of thinking about the market. So let's dive into with Claudio and explore the hot energy markets. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Exploring the Energy Markets podcast. My guest today is Claudio Galimberti, a really global, seasoned professional in the energy markets across the globe. And I have the pleasure to kind of describe his career, his journey. But welcome, Claudio. I think I cannot do justice to your profile, long years, maybe something more interesting, which I didn't talk about, you want to share with our viewers. And what are you really busy with? I'm sure in the US, there is so much going on to keep tabs on, but what are you really doing right now?
Very good. So, well, right now, Mukesh, I'm doing pretty much three things. So at Rystad, so the Rystad, of course, for your listener, is a big company, right? So we have many analysts, 500 analysts, almost 1,000 people, global operations. So my role as the chief economist is to produce the house view. What is that? It's basically the synthesis of everything we produced in terms of the analysis of the energy system. And you are familiar, your listeners are familiar with the idea of having a lot of scenarios, right? So when you are thinking about the medium to long term, of course, you need to be humble enough to say, we don't know what's going to happen, and therefore we are developing scenario, what if analysis. However, what we have noticed is that, this is true for pretty much all the companies around the world, they say great analysis, but what do you really believe in? And the reason they say so is that once they need to make investment decision, right? An investment decision are the most complex decision the company need to make, they need to have one view, right? And that view is basically the house view. So my role is to condense all the analysis as we do into one view of the evolution of the energy system for the next 25 years. That takes away at least 50% of my time, right? When it comes to content production. Then I also look at things like how is the macro economy impacting the energy system. This is what we call an exogenous thing, an exogenous big variable, right? So the macroeconomy ends up impacting the consumption of energy and therefore the energy market. The other 25% is understanding what's happening in the world of geopolitics. And why is that important? Because geopolitics, specifically big events like Venezuela, like Iran, end up, of course, Iran or Ukraine end up impacting the supply of energy, specifically in this case, the supply of oil and gas, but in general, the supply of energy, for instance, rare earths, right? So this is my view, and of course, this is when it comes to the content production. Unfortunately, there is another part of my job, which is to tell the story, not just to produce it, and that's the other 100%.
Well, that may be the most important part of Claudio, right? Yeah.
Of course, the storytelling, the engagement with the clients, and with the industry, and that is probably more than 50% of my time.
Well, fantastic, Claudio. I know we sat together on the Shell trade floor in Houston. I really benefited from a lot of your coaching and mentoring as well. And I know you are not just, you have rich connection with the academia, and you took a lot of courses on that side as well. So today in the podcast, I really want to zoom into the US economy. I want to really understand the drastic measures which we are witnessing across the globe from the US side. Are these really needed? And if so, the answer may be yes. Then what kind of an impact it is having on the US system? And then US is such a big part, is the engine of the world, economy of the world. It has impact on across the globe. So we would like to understand and delve deeper into how it impacts the rest of the world. And obviously, US and China are two big players in the market where we are seeing some sort of push and pull. And I believe whether it is Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Venezuela are part of the equation. So I definitely want to get your views on how you see the markets. Of course, the bottom line, Claudio, is to get your forward-looking views. Plus, the most important, as the mission of XAnalysts is to really empower the analysts with greater knowledge, better understanding. I want to also, make an effort that you can provide how you think about that market. If that sounds good, I want to jump straight into it. So, Claudio, there is so much to talk about. I wanted to begin with, there are some drastic measures since last year, the Liberation Day tariffs the new administration has taken. And this has sent indeed some shock waves across the globe. What's there in the economy, some 3 points you can mention, which require or need such drastic measures? And do you see some more drastic measures coming forward?
Yes, Mukesh. This is I like the fact that it's a very broad theme, but we can pin down a few important things. So, what can we expect in 2026? The global growth is actually very strong, right? So, if I look at the United States, the last quarter. The third quarter was at 4%. The GDP of the Atlanta GDP now is 5%. So it's very strong.
Mm-hmm.
China is also with a very resilient economy, 4.5%, almost 5% on an annual basis. Europe is doing okay. Of course it's struggling, but that's more of a secular problem that Europe has had for many years. But you asked me, what was the drastic measure that was taken? Of course, the tariffs, right? The tariff ended single-handedly, basically in 1 month, 30 years of globalization, right? As we know it.
Yeah.
So it was a shock that the system, experts thought the system wouldn't be able to sustain. And here we are, with an economy, global economy in 2026, which is probably growing faster than what we thought 2025 would be growing to, and that was without the tariffs. So why is that the case? Well, we can spend probably next 3 hours, but the reason for all of this is that the tariffs were implemented at a much lower effective level than what's advertised. So the tariffs went from 2% to 12% in the United States, not 50%. In some cases, they are at 50%, but on various limited items. And the second, which is crucial, most of the countries did not retaliate. That, though, is a key risk in 2026. What we saw, along with an economy that's still growing, is the largest trade surplus ever in China. What this means is that China is moving its trade surplus from the United States, because the United States trade deficit is shrinking, to other countries, specifically to the Europeans, Mexico, and emerging markets. And this is where I can see a key risk for 2026, because Europe has already said that there will not be the dumping ground of China's merchandise. And also, we have seen tariffs popping up in places like Mexico for merchandise coming from China. So there can be a problem there, albeit I think it can be addressed by the Chinese authorities.
So one point, Claudio, I think you made a fantastic observation that 2025 tariffs came like a shockwave, and the probability market was saying recession 60%. Now nobody talks about. And then the economies have actually done well, but with the kind of military kind of actions in Venezuela, I believe, are you saying that there might be risk of now retaliation, not just against the tariff, but against the militaristic kind of ambitions? This might result in more retaliation in 2026 and is a risk to the growth?
Yes. You raised an important point there, which is the geopolitical risk onto the economy. Now, Venezuela just happened a week ago, right? So 8 days ago. So it's very early stages, but it is another humongous seismic shift. It's basically the assertion of sheer power by the United States and by the US president, right? So it's basically a country that says we can change the regime and change the trade flows of crude from that country in a very significant way. Will this have economic reverberations? Now, we can say that we have this is very short time, but we have at least 8 days, right? And what have the market done for the past 8 days? Well, the equity markets completely unfazed. So it's like the Venezuela problem didn't happen. And so again, it does look like the forces that could antagonize such a seismic change are actually kept on the side for the time being.
So it's too early to call, I guess, on the impact, I guess.
It's too early to call, and I would say we need to look very carefully of all the implications. So there are, of course, oil markets implications, but also huge geopolitical implications. Venezuela used to be a staunch ally of China, of Russia, and Iran. Right now, with Delcy.
No, I think I'll definitely jump into US, China, Venezuela. But before we go there, Claudio, I also want to take, this may not be easily understood because the noise in the analysis in the market is what is driving US to take such drastic measures, whether it comes to the Fed, whether it comes to the tariff, whether it comes to, is it really that the internal, because US is a 70% consumption-led economy, and is it the deficit, the $1 trillion number that gets talked around? So maybe throw some numbers and provide some context that is US really needs these drastic measures or no?
So from a macro perspective, the United States ran a huge government deficit and a huge current account deficit for decades, right? So you go back in time and you look at the trade deficits of the United States versus many countries, but primarily China and Europe, that goes as far back as 1990, right? There was a period in time during the shale revolution in the United States, 2010 through 2015, when that deficit narrowed, but then it swelled again. So it's again very huge. So what the current administration decided to do last year was to address that head on with the tariffs. Was it successful? Partly so, right?
So it is indeed the deficit which is driving such a big change.
It is part of that is definitely the deficit. So the fact that the current administration believes that having a current account deficit is a sign of weakness, right? In negotiating with the trading partners. Not everybody believes that to be the case. I frankly, personally think it's not necessarily a sign of weakness, but it creates a dependency, which became very clear during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, the United States and Europe showed that some supply chains were completely in the hands of foreign powers, and they didn't want that to happen. So one way to repatriate that is to use the tariffs, right? So, but what have the tariffs achieved so far? Definitely, they shrunk the deficit. They also increased the government receipts, right? So if you look at the government revenues from all the taxes, tariffs are actually now showing something like 10%, right? They used to be less than 2%. Now the 10% of the total government revenue come from tariffs. And this is something that no government would have been able to achieve by raising taxes, because you don't get elected in the United States if you raise the taxes.
So what you're saying is, no, I think you raise tariffs, you have a nation-first agenda. It's politically good. It's also bridging the tariffs as well. It is also tackling some of the competitors like China, which I think you made a very interesting point, that COVID made it so obvious how supply chain is dependent on China. Probably otherwise people may not have fully realized. And that is what is driving. I also want to ask you, is the oil dollar trade, is that a big factor which is also behind such drastic measures, which are now going beyond tariff into almost the kind of something we have witnessed in Venezuela? We know that India and Russia, China, a lot of countries are trying to have an oil trade outside the dollar. So give me your sense of this whole de-dollarization, and what's your take on it?
Very good point, Mukesh. Anywhere between 10 and 15% of the total trade in oil currently takes place outside of the dollar system, right? And this is primarily China using either the renminbi or other forms of payment to trade for oil and other basically commodities to de-dollarize their system. For sure, Venezuela was part of that, right? So Venezuela produces 1 million barrels per day, give or take, which is 1% of the total supply of oil. And right now, the current administration has asked the big global traders, right, to market this barrel into the open market. That has, of course, advantages. Transparency, it has the advantage of opening up those barrels for all the buyers, and those buyers can still be China and India, right? So they are not necessarily precluded as far as we can say right now. But it also has the advantage of bringing those barrels back into the dollar system. Now, I don't think that the dollar is threatened. The dollar system is still very extremely strong, right? So specifically when it comes to the trading of commodities. But the fact that the Iranian barrels, the Venezuelan barrels, and some of the trade flows between Russia and India / China was occurring outside of the dollar system may have weakened the grip of the dollar on the trade of oil. So this may be indeed the first step. I think that the most important reason for the current administration to bring Venezuela back into the market has more to do with long-term need of reserves, and Venezuela has huge reserves. So this is a more strategic kind of way of solving that problem.
So I guess by now we have established that tariffs was a key to handle the deficit, the burgeoning deficit. The Venezuela, and I think the U.S. administration tried tariffs as a measure also to check the competing adversaries, but probably that didn't work, and that may have required very huge tariffs, and that may have jeopardized the global economy. So I guess there is this pivot towards a different way of tackling the de-dollarization, which is on a tactical basis, like the Venezuela, like the Iran. And longer term, you're saying that, of course, US is pivoting big on AI and data centers, and the demand for energy is only going to grow. And US being the most technologically advanced sort of country will need a lot of energy much faster than it can produce. So that's how, Venezuela fits into it. So with that grounding, I want to go and, the impact, which part of the world would you say these measures, apart from the US, is having the highest impact? And probably my pivot would be to China. Is China really impacted? Yes, no, and why?
So if we're talking about the tariffs, so far China has been very resilient to that. Reason is that the United States is just one of the trading partners of China. The rest of the world, as I said earlier, has not gone into a protectionist binge yet, at least, right? So the rest of the world was very kept their cool against these tariffs. For instance, the European Union got 50% tariffs slapped by the US administration, and they didn't blink. So they didn't retaliate. That was very important. And we said earlier that might not stay like that in 2026. So it's a key downside risk. When it comes to geopolitics, Mukesh, I think it's very early stages. But you can clearly see how the US administration is trying to assert their pretty much power on their backyard. So we've been talking about the Monroe/Donroe doctrine, right? So the fact that the Western, let's call it the Western hemisphere, so basically the Americas, the United States doesn't want to see quote unquote foreign powers in there. So of course you had Venezuela, which was an ally of China. That's now, as far as we can tell, that problem for the U.S. administration has been solved. Of course, many things still need to happen to stabilize the situation, but that administration seems to be compliant with the desires in Washington. Then you have Cuba, right? Then you have probably another country in Latin America could be Colombia, right? But then you have other countries in Latin America that are already very much aligned with the U.S. administration, Chile and of course Argentina, right? Of course, Argentina. So is this having an impact on China? From a energy perspective, Venezuela represented only 5% of the China's imports of oil. China's imports 10 million barrels a day of oil, and it used to import 500,000 barrels. They may still import 200,000 or 300,000, as far as we can tell. We need to see what the big traders do when they put those barrels in the market. But it's not something very difficult to solve, right? So as we know, the oil market is a big global market, and the barrels can come from many parts of the world. Of course, the Venezuelan barrel are, as you know this very well, given your refining and downstream background, they are heavy barrels, therefore not that easy to replace. But of course, you can do many things in order to get a proper crude slate. So I don't think that Venezuela in itself is going to be a big problem, but it's more like the sheer assertion of power that the United States is showing. Is basically a show of force that will have most likely geopolitical implication in 2026.
I think you brought again a very important point in a subtle way, Claudio, and that's what I think long years of being in the industry is your forte, is that tariffs, because they never went to those 500, they were around 1200, didn't produce, and China was able to maneuver and navigate. Now, with the kind of strong actions, particularly removing all the advantages, the Russia sanctions are finally biting and the flows are reducing. There is a tougher sanctions now being talked on Iran. Anybody trades with Iran. And by doing an action in Venezuela, probably US has given an indication, not just to the Latin American countries, but to China, that your investments will be stranded. So I guess tariffs didn't do what this fear or show of power will do. And this may be the way we might see some downside greater impacts on China, because China was trying to play a big part. And let me pivot to then, you talked about Western Hemisphere, and recently I put out my views that probably we are talking of a WOPEC versus a non-WOPEC, right? What I mean, Western Hemisphere oil and producing and exporting countries, where you see Canada, a heavy producer, US, a big light producer. Then in the LATAM, you have Venezuela, heavy producer, Mexico, heavy producer, Guyana and Argentina, light producer, Brazil, heavy, medium, sweet. So in some ways, this hemisphere is full of all kinds of quality of the barrels, the light and heavy, and by blending them, they can always create the medium sour barrels, which this hemisphere always dependent on the Gulf and the Middle Eastern countries. So do you see this really taking shape? Any bold calls you want to make that indeed from Canada to the entire Latin American region, this in years to come will become an integrated big crude or oil supply play, or Venezuela is just an aberration?
Well, you raised very deep thoughts there. Now, the North America system is already fully integrated, right? Canada exports more than 3 million barrels a day of oil into the United States, processed in the mid-continent and the Gulf Coast refineries, right? The Latin America system is also to some extent integrated in the sense that Mexico exports the crude, most of the crude into the Gulf Coast, and Venezuela used to, and right now it most likely will resume to export these heavy barrels into the Gulf Coast refinery that badly needed, right? And then you have Brazil. Brazil is also, Brazil and Guyana are also coming up as big producer. Brazil is dominated by Petrobras, which is an NOC. Guyana is dominated by IOC, that are primarily American. So those barrels are actually, the Guyana barrels are most likely continue to flow into the US. So in a sense, what we noticed is that the 2020s have been so far the decades of the Americas when it comes to oil production. Absolutely no doubt. We have seen tremendous growth in the Permian, to some extent also in the Gulf of America / Gulf of Mexico, Canada, Guyana, Brazil, Argentina. These were all places that have seen huge growth of production. Now you can probably add Venezuela, which is the country with reputably the largest oil reserves in the world. And not only that, let's not forget that Venezuela formally is part of OPEC, right?
Yes.
Now, will it stay part of OPEC?
Can we say, has US joined OPEC by taking over Venezuela?
Yes, the US.
Or maybe the OPEC is coming.
The US president may have a say in the next OPEC meeting, right? So imagine just that. The United States is actually calling the shots in Venezuela. So Venezuela is an enormous seismic shift for the energy system, for the oil markets, for sure, for geopolitics. And it's probably a harbinger of many things to come. As we speak, there are continuous protests going on in another extremely important oil-producing country, which is Iran. And the U.S. administration has said that they stand ready to take action, right? So just imagine that. So it might not just.
So we go to Iran, Claudio. I want to hold some horse there. So I think what you bring about is this is not new. The integration of the Americas has been going on for years. And the chemistry of the oil, in my view, actually makes the integration more desired because of the mix of the heavy and the lights. And US lights probably need more of the heavy barrels to be blended. And what you're pointing out is that this is not an aberration, that this could probably continue and strengthen going forward. I want to stay on a little bit more in Venezuela, and then we shift to Iran. My question on Venezuela is, recently I studied the Venezuelan reserves, And I know is that in 2008, when the oil prices jumped to $150 a barrel, Venezuela just changed the number from 80 million barrels to 300 billion barrels. I have seen various analyses, my own estimates, and talking to people. Probably the reserves are only 100 billion barrels, but that's still a huge amount of oil. We have also seen White House and U.S. administration trying to get the CEOs, and Exxon had a
Right.
lukewarm action. So do you really see that this trade of US Venezuela will become a big trade, or more of the Venezuelan oil will actually likely be going out to rest of the world, or more is going to come to the US system? Have you found a clear take or clear pivot so far, and what do you think?
Yes. Good question. So let's give some numbers so that we anchor the conversation. Venezuela is currently producing 1 million barrels per day, a million point one. At the peak of their production, they were at 3.5. This was 50 years ago, and their share of total output was, or global output was actually 7%, right? Right now, it's just 1%. We do think that Venezuela can go back. We made this estimate just a week ago that under certain conditions, the Venezuela production can go up to 3 million barrels per day, but it's going to take 15 years, $10 billion of investment every year. So it's basically going to cost between 100 and 150 billion dollars, and it's going to take 15 years to get to 3 million barrels per day. Now, what can happen in the short term? Well, in the short term, let's not forget one very important thing. The cokers, given that we're talking about who can process this crude, the cokers, which is a unit that serves to upgrade the production.
Heavy stuff, yeah.
Correct, the heavy stuff, were underutilized for many years in the Gulf Coast. So how much of the extra Venezuelan production can they intake without impacting anything? Probably 200,000-300,000 barrels. So this means that the Canadian barrels that are already coming into the Gulf Coast will not be back out if you increase production by 200,000-300,000 barrels per day. And how much production can you increase if all stars align? So let's say that the U.S. administration completely stabilizes the situation in Venezuela, which, by the way, appears likely, right, so far, and everything goes according to plan. Probably by the end of the year, we increase production by 200,000 barrels per day.
Okay.
So this means that this plays perfectly fine for the U.S. refiner. They are number one beneficiaries of this Venezuela trade. Now, will this impact the U.S. Permian production? This is a question we heard, right? So yesterday, Chris Wright was at Meet the Press here in the United States. It's a very big broadcast, and the question was, will the U.S. producer be impacted by the Venezuela trade? Well, his answer was a little bit foggy. My answer is not initially, for sure not initially, right? Because 300,000 barrels per day are a blip in the global balances. And what affects the price of Brent, the global benchmark, is the global balances.
Now,
so
that's a
this
very,
is not,
okay.
Yes.
Now, that's a very good, you put some numbers because there's so much of foggy analysis happening at the moment. And my own take, Claudio, is that before the TMX pipeline came into being, a lot of the Canadian barrels were actually getting exported from the Gulf Coast to China, to India. So the cokers in the US were probably already saturated what they were getting. So the appetite in the Gulf Coast, based on long years of adaptation to the US shale, has reduced the appetite for the heavy. And with the availability, and the US crudes are getting lighter and lighter. So I think a huge blending play with the heavy and the light, actually the Venezuelan barrels might give a life to the Permian barrels because they will create some chemistry synergy. So to me, it's positive. And if the numbers we are talking about, 200, 300, I agree with you that this is probably a blip. So more of the barrels will likely make to the waters. Okay, so let's give a quick take on Canada. And I want to ask this question, Claudio, that the moment this news came of Venezuelan flow to Canada, a lot of the American oil company stocks went up and the Canadians jittered, right?
Right.
My view is that yes, but Canada has found an alternative, which is China, about 500,000 barrels, and maybe some
Yeah.
more can flow, but not a lot can flow. And Canada had to find an outlet because the California and the PAD 5 refineries, who are the big
Right.
players, are also in
Shut it down.
closures, in decline. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, is it possible that availability of the Venezuelan barrels to the US Gulf Coast reinvigorates cokers and these big refiners, because you will get this crude at a discount, and in some time Venezuela again gets into some trouble, and then these new investments or changes in the refining system would want Canadian barrels. So could it be a short time problem for the Canada, but might prove to be a real advantage in some years?
Yeah, I think so, in the sense that, in the EU, I remember you were teaching me all of this when we were at Shell, right? So the crude slate, the dumbbell, the role of hydrogen, and so on and so forth. But you raised a very important point, which is there was an adaptation of the U.S. refinery to the lighter crude coming from the Permian and the shrinking crude coming from Venezuela. Venezuela was under sanctions in 2019, right? So, and even before. So, in a sense, and also the Mexican production, which is a very heavy production too, the Maya kept on shrinking. Like so the thing to bear in mind is that you currently have an administration in the United States which is completely detached from any climate consideration, right? So the up until the previous administration, what you had, it was a lot of concerns about emissions. Those are completely out of the window, which means that the idea of bringing very heavy barrels from Canada, maybe with another pipeline, the idea now of bringing additional barrels from Venezuela into big refineries that up until a few years ago were designed to process this very heavy crude, absolutely makes sense. So if your question is, can we see perhaps even an investment in additional cokers, I would say it's possible. You probably have, you are really the expert here, but I can see, especially if you have more and more crude coming from Canada, and Canada is, our view at Rystad is that Canada production will keep on increasing. If now suddenly you have Venezuela going from 1 to 2 million barrels per day by the end of the decade, and probably 3 million barrels per day by the end of the 2030s, then yes, then you need a cokers. And you might not have enough coking capacity.
And I think sometimes I also think, I mean, these might be wild card scenarios for now, but if you really look at the world, the sanctions driven has made the world very inefficient. Russian barrels travel long distances to China when Europe pipeline was so this has an ESG footprint. What's the point of heavy Venezuelan barrels traveling to China all the way, long distances, gives, I would say, environmental risk because of the vessels traveling when it can travel very next door to the US. So, and Canada and US can be connected via pipelines. They don't need to use the sea routes and pollute the ocean, so removes the spill. So I see that there are some economic efficiency and environmental benefits in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, if it operates as an integrated whole versus the inefficient trades that are happening. So, well, time will tell whether the geopolitics will win or the chemistry or these things will. I want to shift a little bit more now towards Iran. Okay.
Yes.
I know this is a hot topic. The dominant view right now in my mind is that probably US will let it implode as it is happening. Iran is not Venezuela. Iran does not have the nuclear deterrent, but Iran has the Strait of Hormuz, which is almost in my mind a nuclear thing. And Iran has seen what US can do in Venezuela. So probably the Revolutionary Guards in Iran now, in the face of such a grave danger, might finally do something terrible in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran itself has evacuated all its tanks and send the oil already to China. We have seen the floating storage of Iranian barrels increasing to China. So probably Iran may have less to lose, but others may have more to lose. Strait of Hormuz being the pseudo-nuclear thing. What's your take on it? How do we see the picture? And is there a call you can make, or probably too early?
Yeah, no, I mean, making calls on these events is always really a guessing game. It's not really a forecasting, because there are too many elements to consider there. You cannot have a model, right? You can have a model of macroeconomics, but it's very difficult to have a model
So
of
maybe
geopolitics.
what factors come in your mind, because that might help a lot of analysts.
Right. So let me then explain my opinion about the Strait of Hormuz. The last time I was traveling to Singapore, I remember I was drawn into hastily into a TV interview on, I think it was probably the BBC. And they were asking me, what's going to happen to the Strait of Hormuz? And I recall back then, so there was a huge, and we're talking just about 6 months ago, there was a huge kind of attention, global attention about the Strait of Hormuz, something like 18, 19 million barrels a day of oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, right? So it's the most important strait, along with the Strait of Malacca, when it comes to the flow of commodities. And of course, it sits entirely on the one side into the territory of Iran. Now, the Strait of Hormuz has been the Straits of Hormuz for the past 8 years. So Iran started to produce oil at the end of the Second World War. So has Saudi Arabia. So has the United Emirates and Kuwait, right? How many times there was a war between Iran and Iraq back in the 1980s, and that lasted for 8 years. And of course, since the takeover of power Ayatollah in 1979, Iran has been at loggerheads with most of the West, particularly the United States, and of course Israel, right? So we're talking about more than 50 years, more than 70 years of very hard, right? So it's a lot of wars, proxy war, and so on and so forth. Now the question I have for you is, how many times has the Strait of Hormuz been blocked in these 8 years?
Well,
one, and it was not blocked. They tried to mine it, but they failed. And the reason is that the Strait of Hormuz, it is a strait, but it's actually very large. We're talking about 20 miles. It's very difficult for an army which is not as developed as the army of the United States or the army of Russia or the army of China to actually take control of the Straits of Hormuz, especially because you have the army of the United States patrolling the Straits of Hormuz.
Very good point, Claudio. Okay.
So the history is kind of teaching us it's going to be very complicated. On top of that, if Iran attempts to do it and for some reason manages to disrupt, who is benefiting and who is going to be hurt? The benefit are probably for a short period of time Iran, because they can have a show of power. Look at what we can do. Who's going to stand to hurt from that? The entire world, not just the United States, but even China.
China probably might be the biggest.
Of course, because China imports
and Russia.
Oil. And Russia, everybody, the entire global economy will
and
be
Europe maybe more. And Europe
yeah.
has some soft corner probably with Iran compared to the US right now.
Correct.
Yes, okay. Good point.
Correct. So this tells you if one country has the entire world against it, probably they're not going to succeed. So that is my take on that. Yes, go ahead.
So, Claudio, fascinating thoughts and views on Venezuela, Iran. These are all very unique situations with geographies and many other facets involved. I want to shift gear and talk about Canada and Russia. Those are probably the two countries where US will not do or take the action as it might take in Iran or in Venezuela. So I want to first ask, what's your take on Russia? How do you see this really resolving? Is there a resolution on Ukraine-Russia crisis? Why and how? Of course, I know it's hard to predict, but I think it's very useful to understand how you think about it. And that's where probably a lot of analysts will benefit. And that's what my mission is actually with the XAnalysts, is to really enable the analysts. So take on Russia, how should one think about it?
Yes, yes. So good question there. Good also framing of the question in the sense that, as we said, it's difficult to predict these geopolitical events, but you can anchor them onto some important point that we know, right? And these points are certain. There has been a large amount of fatalities taking place in the past 4 years. On both sides, of course, the population is wary. There is less and less support in Ukraine, but also in Russia about this war effort that's been going on for, at this point, come February, almost as long as the Second World War, right? So we're talking about 4 years. So the Russian economy started to feel the pinch of the sanctions, specifically the last one that were imposed in the last 3-4 months. So the sanctions are biting, and the Russian economy, specifically with an oil price that keeps on declining, right? Right now it's $64 per barrel, but the expectation from most of the analysts, us included, is that the first half of 2026 will probably see market potentially in contango at some point, right? So it means below $60 per barrel. So this is going to have an impact on the Russian economy. Probably the single most important variable for the Russian economy is the price of oil, right? And the price of oil is going down, which is what most analysts expect. That is going to have potentially constrained the war effort by Russia. So it is kind of, there are many factors that point to finally a resolution of the conflict of the war between Ukraine and Russia.
So your point is, forget about the geopolitics. Ultimately, the economy of Russia is now, and you're right about it, the first time the October sanctions are biting, and we have seen clearly the decrease in the flows. We've also seen Ukraine attacks on the Russian infrastructure getting stronger and stronger. So, and now the last, thing would be a very low oil price or a contango that might hit and resolve the Russian solution. I think that's very interesting, though I've been maintaining that I don't see contango coming in the oil markets, because that's what OPEC will certainly guard against. But you never know. Right now, we are in a different territory. Canada.
Yes.
So Canada.
So, yes. So I just would like to say a few things about Russia. So Russia, once let's work on the scenario in which the Russian the war between Ukraine and Russia is solved. What's going to happen to the whole energy trade flows that you were mentioning earlier? Will they go back to Europe? It's a very legitimate question, right? So from a purely logistic perspective, oil and gas produced in Russia makes total sense to go to Europe. There is one big caveat, and this, though, is a very important geopolitical caveat. I do believe that the alliance between Russia and China has become stronger and stronger. And the Power of Siberia 2, which is an important natural gas pipeline being built between Russia and China, is there to signify that bringing Russia back into the Western economic system is not going to be a walk down the park at all. So there may be geopolitical consideration, economic consideration. As we said, from an economic standpoint, those barrels and those natural gas produced in Russia makes total sense to be delivered into Europe. And that was the case for 50 years. But right now, we are in a geopolitical situation in which China and Russia form a very important alliance. And from that standpoint, those barrels may continue to flow to China.
No, but I tend to agree also, Claudio, that even if Europe wants the Russian energy, that's a very important short for the US length. And US will probably not let the gift of Europe become available for Russia. So I guess that whatever happens, even if Europe wants, is not getting back, is probably a good way to think about. Let's talk about Canada. Canada, a
Yes.
very traditional integrated player with the US, really a
Right.
sizable producer in the north, and there is quite a big connection. And the US reversed a lot of pipelines in the Gulf Coast, which used to take Middle Eastern barrels upwards because now the
Yes.
Canadian flows come downwards, right? And a big part of the US system, not so much in the Gulf Coast, but in the upper part of the US, is so heavily dependent on the Canadian barrel that there is no other alternative for them, right? The coking refineries
Correct.
in the Chicago area, probably.
Right.
So how do you see that now? Will Canada intensify its effort today, 500, 600, to take it to 1 million barrels, 2 million barrels, to have more pipeline options going towards China? Or this 500 was just an experiment, it will only stop there, and finally Canada might actually become more integrated with the US? What's your take, at least for
Hmm.
2026?
Well, probably I would say that if I was in the Canadian producer, optionality always makes sense. The problem is always the cost of optionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is exactly at the heart of everything related to, the project economics and trading, long-term trading, creating optionality, but the cost of optionality, right? So building another pipeline to bring the barrels into British Columbia, of course, makes sense. It's going to take years. It's going to cost a lot of billions, and therefore you need to basically assume to have a pretty optimistic view on the consumption of oil in China, which for many reasons we
Good
shouldn't be
point.
that optimistic, right? So
Good
China
point.
is probably one of the countries where oil demand may be peaking rather than plateauing, right? And the reason is that all these electric vehicles, 50% of the new sales in China of vehicles are actually electric vehicles. So there is this aspect that needs to be considered. The system between Canada and the United States has been integrated for decades. There has been a huge increase, specifically in the past 3 decades, of exports from Canada into the United States. Of course, right now there are these tensions between the current administration in Canada and the one in the United States. I would say, this may be temporary. As a matter of fact, if you look at basically the trade between Canada and the United States has remained very, very resilient, even in 2025. The level of tariffs that Canada pays into the United States are not that high because they are still part of a trade deal that was actually signed by by the U.S. administration 7 years ago, right? So if we take all of this into consideration, I think that Canada will still be integrated in the United States, albeit they might want to build some optionality in the longer term.
And I would say that the optionality is actually mutually beneficial to US and Canada, because as the refineries follow a certain cyclical maintenance, right? So and the Canada production also goes through some cyclical maintenance. So it might be a good idea. Otherwise, it gets hurt, and the discounts fluctuate a lot more in those periods. So having some optionality to put barrels on the water might actually give some strength to Canada, and that strength might result in lower cost available to the US, to the consumers, in the refinery consumers. So I think that's a very interesting take, and I think you made a very good point about China not so hungry for oil, and the heavy crude oils are the ones which are used to convert to a lot of diesel and the distillates, whereas China is actually changing the refinery system from 38% diesel to 27% diesel yields. So they definitely don't need these kind of barrels going a lot more towards the China. So now I think very good point on Canada. So I guess, Claudio, we have covered Russia. You say that price will do the job, and maybe contango might do the job, and the military and the diplomatic might not solve. So the Russia solver will be economics. Canada and US probably stay integrated. US actions in Venezuela might send a signal to rest of the Latin countries to become more integrated. And I jokingly talked about the WOPEC, WHOPEC.
Yes.
It might come out to be true, and it might not sound so weird to talk in future. On China, I think the tariffs, China was able to sustain resilient by finding alternatives. But I think the stance US is taking on Iran, on Latin, which is much more stronger, this might force a lot of the Latin American countries to take investments from China. So I think the military posture is where probably more, I would say, chinks in Chinese economy might show up in sort of 2026. These are very complex markets, Claudio, right? I don't want to leave you go with two very quick questions. One, any three takes for 2026, and any three messages for analysts looking at the market that don't forget to watch out these things. Three projections for 2026 and three messages for the analyst community across the globe.
Very good. So number one, the global economy is resilient. So my expectation is that we will see a resilient global economy because AI is starting to have a positive effect on productivity gains. So it's very early stages, but the combination of huge investments and also productivity growth makes me optimistic.
Resilient, okay.
So that's number one. Number two, the commodity markets, specifically oil and gas, are going to be oversupplied. The global economy is resilient. There are some downside risks, specifically the potential rise of protectionism outside of the United States, specifically Europe. I would be very, very careful about Europe. Then there are two signposts. One is the change of the Federal Reserve. We didn't speak about this. The Federal Reserve may lose its independence, and that may be another shock to the system. We see how the entire economy could withstand the potential, it's not lost yet, but potential loss of independence from the White House. And I would say that the other key things to bear in mind is that there's going to be midterm election in the United States in November, which means that the economy will probably be on a sugar high until then, right?
Okay.
If you think about it.
So
this is the economy. Yes, resilience. When it comes to the global markets of energy, we foresee length, in some cases extreme length, when it comes to oil and gas, and also the solar market. The solar markets are currently oversupplied. So we are in an abundance of energy supply, which is a good thing for the global economy, but not necessarily a good thing for, of course, the energy producer. So those parts of the economy that are dependent on energy, I think of Texas, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Canada, Brazil, they probably going to be suffering a little bit, especially the oil price and the natural and LNG price are dropping, right? I do not foresee, I'm with you, I do not foresee extremely low oil prices, but potentially, especially if OPEC does not intervene timely, we can see the market flipping into contango. I argue that the fair price of Brent right now is well into the 50s, and the only reason why we are at 62, 63 is that you have turmoil in Iran, turmoil in Ukraine, and turmoil in Venezuela.
Now,
then there is then
strong economy, energy length. What's the third one?
The third one is the geopolitical shifts. We are seeing seismic shift of a magnitude we haven't seen in years, right? So the last time we saw an event like Venezuela was the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, a geopolitical event that is really turning the world as we know it upside down. We may be going in a world in which the Western countries are aligning with the United States. The most of the emerging markets are aligning with China. Not all of them. For instance, India, Brazil might be the non-aligned countries. If you will recall, during the Iron Curtain, you had those countries that aligned with the USSR, those with the United States, and then there were the misaligned, the non-aligned countries. India was one of them. India may still be a country, and you would know this more than anybody else in this conversation between you and I, but this may be a country that play on both tables. But why is that important? Because the United States is fundamentally, as of right now, a petro-state when it comes to the energy. It's a major oil and gas producer. And China is an electro-state. It is a major solar and electricity producers. So this means that strategically, those countries that align with the United States will somehow be forced, in a way, to increase their consumption of oil and gas. And those that align with the United States, and these include many African countries, if you think about it, they may actually be brought more into the electro-states.
They may skip some oil age. Yeah.
Now,
fascinating point. I think this is just, I mean, probably it requires the caliber of you and the experience behind your bag to think like this, Claudio. I think now this is so much more, like brought to surface of the two energy lengths and energy shorts in the world and how they are acting, and what we are witnessing in between is just those forces colliding to find a new equilibrium. Let's see what kind of a new equilibrium we can find. I will end probably this call, this session on, it has given me a thought that the US might succeed in the world in terms of energy, its domination. But is there a worry inside? So that might be the question we can leave, not discuss, that you guys might build this domination across the globe. But within the US, there are a lot of things happening. And the midterm elections, as you pointed, are very critical to watch.
Yeah. Midterm election is extremely important because that may decide the fate of all these policies, right? Yes. Not entirely, but of course, if you have a completely different electoral outcome, then all these policies become more difficult to bring about. But so far, the energy dominance that was the ticket through which this administration was elected is in full display. It's absolutely in full display right now.
No, thank you, Claudio. Wish you very well. And long years we work together, and I think it's fun to do this again. Look forward to welcoming you back into Australia. We had a wonderful trip in Asia, Australia. So look forward to more such conversations. And thank you again, and hope the viewers really find your analysis, your thought process, more than just the calls you make, how you think about the market, more illuminating and more beneficial. Thank you again. Yes.
Thank you, Mukesh. Let me say just a few words. I admire what you're doing. I think that educating the world about how to interpret, how to analyze the energy is extremely important. And I do not know anybody in the world that can do this better than you.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Let's do more. Thanks, Claudio.
Thank you. Thank you.
XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.